Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I'm Marion Rutherford and I'm presenting today with Lorna Johnston.
Hi there. Anxiety-related absence is a long-standing issue that's been highlighted by the COVID context. Traditional approaches and mindsets haven't always led to the best outcomes for autistic learners, and it's not a straightforward issue, but we're offering our perspective today on how it could be approached. Because of our experience of this issue in practice, together with the conversations we've had with young people and parents, we might be challenging some assumptions and language and encouraging you to think about this issue in some new ways today. But we also hope that the need to approach some young people differently will resonate. We can learn most about this when we really listen to autistic perspective, and we're trying to represent this as well as we can today. Here's our contact information. If you're tweeting today, you can follow us on @NAIT Scotland. And we're going to start with a quick note on terminology. Recent research suggests that the majority of autistic adults prefer identity-first language. This means using terms like autistic person rather than person with autism. Here's a clip from Charlene Tate from Scottish Autism, who'll say a bit more about language and mindsets.
I'm Charlene Tate, Deputy Chief Executive of Scottish Autism. I'm very grateful to the NAIT team to give me this opportunity to talk to you for a really short while about the issue of school refusal. I think it's really important that we challenge the language that we use around this issue, and that you, as professionals working in the field, reflect on how stigmatising that language can be and how it actually diverts us from what the true issues really are. It's not about school refusal, it's about anxiety. And if we think about anxiety-related absence, we are really far down the road of helping to support children who experience it. So what I would ask you to do is join this kind of movement for change and think differently about children who are not attending school. Autistic children want to learn. Autistic children want to be sociable. Autistic children want to be in school. But there are times, and for a growing number of them, where the anxiety related to that is just so overwhelming that going to school is not a reasonable trade-off for your mental health and your well-being. I think if we think about things differently, it enables us to do things differently. And whilst a child or young person is struggling to manage overwhelming anxiety, it is the adults around about them who can change. It is the environment they are in that can change. So a little bit of empathy for children who are not coming to school because of anxiety goes a long way. So let's move on from this idea of school refusal and let's call it out for what it is. It's anxiety-related absence, and hopefully thinking about it in that way will help us, the adults, the professionals, the educators, to do something differently, to behave differently. It's our behaviour that often has to change in this scenario to make it possible for a child to access school once again. Thank you.
Thanks to Charlene. The plan for this session is to start with key messages. We're going to talk a bit about the Scottish context. We're going to think about understanding anxiety-related absence, and in particular the family perspective. We're going to consider what steps we can take, talk a bit about reflective practice, and then have a reminder of the key messages before taking some time at the end for some questions from the audience. There are key messages in the anxiety-related absence resource that were developed in the context of return from the first COVID lockdown, and these are still relevant. However, in planning this webinar in the current context, we feel that these on the screen now are the most relevant key messages for today. So, predictable, desirable, and meaningful. Listen without judgment. A plan before a person. Think about the 24-hour child. Learn from when they have attended school. Have two named key adults. Anticipate transitions. The end of the day is the end of the day. Have consistently high expectations, and good things should just happen. Here's a short clip about Alex, who we'll hear from a few times today. She's an autistic teenager, diagnosed at the age of 14, and for whom school attendance was often under 30%.
I think it started when school started to get more complex and hard to deal with. Kind of like classes got bigger and harder, and social situations got a lot harder to navigate. I kind of had like very routine ways that I knew would work around like my friends, and then all of a sudden like one day they're just like operating in entirely new ways that are just harder to work out. And I think that was probably really when I was probably 13 or 14. And then like it just started with just when I got really overwhelmed. Like I was always exhausted at school, and I'd always kind of feel like I was just kind of like struggling to get there on time and to get everything organised and keep on top of everything and deadlines and everything. And then obviously when things get harder in terms of like what you're learning, that doesn't get any easier. And then I'd always kind of come home and just not be able to function and just feel absolutely overwhelmed and just have to just like lie down and just absolutely recharge. And I always just felt really wiped. And I guess kind of just as things started getting more overwhelming, the anxiety just really started to rise, and I just used to get really anxious about social situations and sensory scenarios and how I was going to cope in like theoretical situations, but also just like things like the assembly and the lunch hall was really hard, and even like the study and common areas I used to get really worried about. And then it kind of started when I was like 13 to 14, where it would just be the odd day, kind of like just every now and then I would just be like, no, I just can't cope today. And I always thought, because at the time I wasn't diagnosed, like I was just thinking it was just like a panic attack. But knowing kind of what I do now about myself, it was just like overwhelmed and just feeling frantic. And then just kind of as life got on, I just kind of got into the kind of routine and mindset of just thinking I couldn't do school. And then it was a lot of it became a daily struggle of just like unable to just get out the door. So then it just evolved into more and more of a problem as I got higher up into high school. So kind of like S1 and S2 was just very much the odd day here and there, but by S3 it was like a couple days a week. And then kind of S4 and S4 really was probably the height of it, where it was kind of like my attendance was below 50%, if not way lower. And then obviously lockdown happened and isolation, so it's a very hard thing to measure now because it was all at home. But that kind of made things even harder when we did go back, because it was very much a lot of my anxiety was just because I'd again just gotten into the pattern of not being used to it and not having any routines, and everything was new, and all my classrooms had moved about, and like there was different regulations and rules, and I hadn't seen anyone in so long, so I felt really out of practice with the whole thing. That it just felt really scary. And at that point it was just like, at that point I was in S6, so the absolute temptation was just to just be like it's, you know, like that school just ticked now.
We have been aware of the increasing challenge of anxiety-related absence during COVID, and we wrote the NAIT Anxiety-Related Absence Resource and the Enquire Parent Guidance in 2020. As we've come out of lockdown, we've heard from our networks that this continues to be a growing concern. We have been overwhelmed by the demand for this webinar, and we appreciate that it's an issue for which there's often not a quick fix at a time when demand on professional teams are high. So, why is there a focus on autism? This is because attendance at school is a particular issue for autistic individuals. This was raised in the Not Included, Not Engaged, Not Involved report 2019, which highlights a need for change. All teachers will come across autistic children in their class, and they account for more of the challenges reported than other additional support needs. We know that in Scottish schools, 2.4% of children are autistic. 86% of autistic children attend mainstream schools, and a disproportionate 4.6% of exclusions in Scotland are of autistic learners. 68% of tribunals in 27 to 18 related to autistic learners, and school refusal is the most common reason for school absence in autistic children. We've contacted a number of local authority leads who've all said that anxiety-related absence is on the increase and that they consistently estimate that around 70% of those who require support for this issue were either diagnosed as autistic or had related support needs. You might be familiar with Luke Bearden's golden equation. Autism plus environment equals outcome. And if you know NAIT, you'll know that environment first is always one of our key messages. Challenges with anxiety are not inevitable, but very common in autistic adults. It's important that we remember that outcomes are as a result of the interaction between the individual and their environment. And by this, we mean the physical and the social environment, which is the attitudes and interactions of others around the individual. Adults tell us that in the past, anxiety was misunderstood, and that as children, they weren't recognised as autistic. Autism's lifelong, and finding solutions in earlier years is important as the experiences underpinning anxiety-related absence continue to have an impact in adulthood. In terms of the local context in Scotland, we've had conversations with several local authority leads. The feedback is quite consistent, and we're sure it'll be no surprise to you. It's all that you're experiencing in schools at the moment. There seems to be a sharp increase in children with low attendance. Usually anything less than 80% would be a cause for concern. And one local authority has described a doubling of children with under 10, 20 or 30% attendance compared to 3 years ago. High COVID absence is likely to have played a big part, and we've not found any hard statistics about how much of this is anxiety related. However, anxiety related absence does seem to be on the increase, and where it's occurring at an earlier age. Some local areas have funded local teams to address these issues, and of those identified as experiencing anxiety-related absence, we're hearing consistently that around 70% of these individuals are autistic. There's not a huge amount of up-to-date guidance on this issue, and what there is does not have an autism lens. Local areas have told us some of the things that are being considered are professional learning around what's historically been termed emotionally based school avoidance, multi-agency and third sector services being commissioned under whole family support and community mental health monies, and the day-to-day relational practice and targeted supports that are being used in schools, and avoiding the catch-up mantra too. Areas are considering blended pathways for a greater number of children, but the feedback we've had is that people are looking for evidence-informed ways to approach this challenge, and we hope there might be aspects of this guidance that would be useful to you as a framework going forward. Here's a short clip where Alex describes her experience in CAMS, which for her felt as though it missed the mark because it didn't focus on the right things. Goals for psychological therapies, including adapted CBT and acceptance commitment therapy, were set around accepting diagnosis at the point where Alex felt that she already had accepted it, and achieving 50% school attendance.
The whole CBT thing really did confuse me. It was a trial thing, so it was all kind of recorded, and I didn't really fully understand kind of what it was and what it was trying to do. It was very much trying to, again, approach things from an anxiety point of view and talk through things and understand things. But I think it was very much trying to change my kind of mindset and how I was kind of approaching things and approaching how I was looking at school and what I was kind of feeling anxious and how to kind of change those thoughts. But in actual fact, I think it would have been a lot easier if I just said to my 14-year-old self, like, actually, you don't need to go and sit in the hall with 450 people, because that's really what I was really anxious about. And I think having those kind of practical solutions were what I found a lot more helpful than just kind of going through and talking through things that just left me feeling really frustrated and like I couldn't get to the bottom of the problem, because I was just trying to find a solution to the mindset that just didn't exist. And we had this review meeting towards the kind of the end of our sessions that was just like, we're not getting anywhere with the attendance, like the therapy's kind of not working, and it just left me feeling really frustrated. And then they started to kind of push things like medication and stuff like that because we weren't getting to the bottom of this problem. And it's weird looking at it retrospectively, because being out of school, I'm very much able to shape my routines and my interactions around what I can cope with, and very much have like kind of communication with my university around like how I'm interacting with lecturers and submitting assignments and things like that in a way that kind of works for me. And kind of when I look back at school, what worked best for me was when they were kind of working with me to create practical solutions. A lot of the problems, particularly around anxiety and particularly around just feeling really low, were just feeling like I couldn't do it and just this constant feeling of failure. When in actual fact, like, like there were ways in school where I was succeeding, but it was just hard to see that because it was constantly just around like, whether or not I was getting in at 9 a.m. every day. And the more that becomes built into this big goal, the more it just becomes something really scary.
We're all here today because we have a shared goal. In the past, we would have thought about that goal differently, with more of an emphasis on the child changing. We might have had a target for the young person to attend for more than 50% of the time, or that they'll be less anxious, or that they maybe would use breathing techniques to manage their anxiety. Goals constructed in this way are missing key elements. So we really like the way that goals are written within the CERT's planning framework, where all goals have two parts and highlight that the young person will do something when the adults do something else. We suggest our goal for the young person is to be motivated to come to school and actively and meaningfully engaged when there. And that's when the adults around them make certain adaptations. For example, understand and make adaptations for sensory preferences, make the day predictable through consistently using a developmentally relevant visual timetable, and make the day desirable by infusing activities with the young person's interests. And here's another clip. Alex describes to us her experience of having a goal focused on leaving the house.
I think when people were building in practical solutions into my life to try and get me kind of over this problem, a lot of them were to try and get me to leave the house and like try and identify what was stopping me from getting over the door, which was frustrating because one, it put a lot of pressure on me to just kind of get rid of the anxiety and change the mindset. But also it didn't really identify that a lot of the problem was on where I was going and the anxiety I was around on school. And so some of the things that were suggested by CAMS and things were like going somewhere before I went to school so that by the time I reached school my anxiety was lower, which didn't really draw the dots between the anxiety and going to school at all, because if I knew I was going to school my anxiety levels were constantly going to be high. And so I think it would have been helpful to have more of an approach on why I was anxious at school, more than like why I was so anxious to kind of leave the house. Because again, a lot of my anxiety rooted back to a fear of school and the environment that was there.
Once we have a goal or a target, then we make a plan to meet that target by making every day as predictable, desirable, and meaningful as possible. We've heard some really nice examples of people putting an autism lens on their practice and planning and taking account of children's needs and preferences and making learning meaningful. This might include working in partnership with health colleagues, for example, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, and others who bring a different perspective. And many of you will already be applying adaptations to the school environment, whether it's visual supports, having a safe space, or adapting communication. It's really important that we think about all of these elements in an effective plan. If you spend a lot of time supporting the family at home to get the child out the door to school, but the school environment doesn't change, then the goal is less likely to be achieved. If you do a huge amount of work in school to adapt the social and physical environment, but you're not thinking about the 24-hour child and listening to and supporting parents, we risk a failure of our intended goal again. And if someone spends time talking with the young person, getting to know their needs and preferences, but doesn't work together with school staff, or perhaps relies on the young person or their family to share the information, or maybe doesn't use that information in thinking about how to change the home and school environment, we might find it hard to make the changes that we wish to see. So we've shared this diagram with you today, hopefully to be something you can take away when you're thinking about your planning to make sure you've covered all the essential elements. And you might find that once you know an individual, you may need particular plans to support transition, communication supports, and sensory supports at different times of the day. Too often, when we're asked to support in tricky situations, the team around the child reach the conclusion that what's needed is an additional person. Before introducing a person, there are some key steps. And first, you need to observe, assess, and agree priorities. Only after you've a target set are you ready to think about how you might meet that target in a way that takes account of the child's developmental level. The plan may or may not require a person, and ultimately we're aiming to support the child to be independent. The person could be thought of as an independence facilitator, and the person needs a plan. Anxiety-related absence occurs when learners are either reluctant to go to school or have reduced attendance or are not attending. This document is available on our website, Anxiety-Related Absence, a Guide for Practice. This guidance was developed through review of published literature, national and local guidance in consultation with the autism community, including autistic people, parents of autistic individuals, professionals from health, education, and the third sector. And there are two parts to the document. So firstly, understanding anxiety-related absence, and secondly, what steps can we take? Anxiety-related absence can be existing or emerging. There are children and young people that you'll know where this is a very established pattern and that they rarely or never attend school. For other learners, there are reasons emerging that make attendance at school very difficult for them. The resource provides information about each of these things. It's important that we don't wait for a crisis. Anxiety in autistic learners might present in a range of ways, and it's important to be aware of this. Understanding an individual's reasons for being anxious will help us with identifying the most relevant solutions. And although anxiety-related absence is perceived as a school problem, it's important to consider the 24-hour life of the child and the impact on the family. It's helpful to understand each individual's perspective on peer relationships and how this might affect their motivation to attend school. We're fairly confident that you know what we mean by the physical environment. There's information about this on the NAIT website and on the Autism Toolbox. But the social environment is such a varied thing. Luke Bearden's chapter, Masking Social Anxiety and the Classroom, in this book here, is well worth a read. He describes that the social environment can be any person in the vicinity. How they communicate can impact positively or negatively on others, whether this is direct verbal interaction, emails, or an overheard conversation across the room. Many people will process this subconsciously and in the moment. Autistic people may not. They are often consciously processing and trying to make sense of it all, which can be experienced as quite overwhelming and unsustainable. This explains the social anxiety and exhaustion of people constantly having to work harder than their non-autistic peers in a neurotypical world. In addition to processing differences, autistic people may not know the ever-changing unwritten social rules, who to listen to and why, who they should be responding to and how to grade the social contact by level of importance, and how to understand non-verbal communication. They might not know whether implied meaning is real or not, and whether instructions are trustworthy, and they might find lies or things that they perceive to be lies as utterly distressing. Unpicking which aspects of the social environment have impact can take time, and often the individual won't be able to tell us. It's the job of the team around the young person to observe and understand the individual. One way to handle social anxiety, social demands, and disrupted expectations is to mask. This is a term we're increasingly familiar with, and you might want to look at Laura Hull's work on this. When we say that someone who's autistic is masking, we mean that they're using strategies to hide their autistic differences from other people or to find ways around things that they struggle with because of autism. Masking is very common indeed, but as the word suggests, it often goes undetected. The individual may not be doing it deliberately or consciously, but it might serve a helpful purpose. Our job is to understand it and to avoid the need for it rather than setting a goal to stop it happening. Masking, however, comes at a price to mental well-being. It's hugely draining, and often the individual can't focus on learning and can't enjoy the situation that they're in. They might appear fine, and so they don't get the support that could help, but they're very much not fine. Because they look fine, the adults around them don't always believe attempts to express their distress, and when parents describe meltdowns at home, the blame can be placed with them. And here's clip 5 of Alex describing masking in her own words.
I think I realised very early on that if I put on a very kind of bubbly and happy persona when I was at school, it was easier to feel accepted and liked by like my peers and by teachers, because I couldn't really understand any more kind of subtle indicators to people that I wanted to spend time with them and socialise with them other than just like really smiley, really like 100% energy all of the time. And that was kind of my formula for a long time. Like going back to when I was a kid, I've always been known as incredibly bubbly, and I've used that as a social coping strategy. But obviously that got incredibly exhausting when I constantly had to put on that persona when I was at school around people, and it would just constantly feel just massively tiring if I felt like I constantly had to smile and pretend like everything was okay when in fact I was really struggling.
For all the reasons we've discussed, it can be hard for autistic children and young people to trust that everyday life, including school, will be predictable, desirable, and meaningful to them. For this reason, the consequence might be autistic meltdowns and shutdowns, which we sometimes refer to as going over the losing it line. Often we're asked for ideas for dealing with behaviours or meltdowns when young people have anxiety at a very high level. And whilst we would always advocate providing the right support to avoid getting to this point, we might not always get it right. Within the anxiety-related absence resource, we use the losing it line as a tool to help people to understand that the reactions that they see are unlikely to be explained by the last thing that happened. In actual fact, a wide range of factors in a young person's environment and routines are likely to have contributed. We're going to talk you now through a scenario using the tool, and we start with a graph. The y-axis up the side marks the level of anxiety, and the x-axis along the bottom is the passage of time. And each point on the coloured lines represents a different event in the child or young person's day. The blue line along the lower part of the graph represents most non-autistic people on an average day, with nothing big or significant going on in their life to cause major distress. They might get up in the morning, worried about the day ahead. But they calm themselves down, thinking calmly about the day ahead over a cup of tea. They set off for work, and there's a diversion on the road, and they start to get anxious about getting late and take a detour. Lots of other people have taken the same route, and now they're stuck in traffic and they're very late. Suddenly, the car behind bangs into theirs. No one's hurt, but it's going to take the rest of that day for them to return to the level they were at the beginning of the day. For a range of reasons, autistic young people are likely to start their day at the higher level, the green line. They may waken up anxious, but their parent calms them down by looking at their home visual timetable for the day. There's none of their favourite cereal left, but they find an alternative they like. They set off to school later than usual, so someone else got to the front of the line. Someone else got the seat they'd wanted to sit in. Someone brushed past them and pushed them softly on the arm. They're over the losing it line. They've lost it, they're on the ground, they're kicking and screaming. And the adults are all standing around saying, there's no reason for that at all. It's come from absolutely nowhere. But it hasn't. We can't take away all the sources of anxiety for the young person, but we can try to reduce them. And one of the simplest ways to do this is to make the young person's day predictable and take steps to preempt or avoid disrupted expectations. An individual's losing it line might not be obvious. It might not be an immediate display that you can see clearly. We can follow this approach when there's an overt display in front of us. However, for some of the young people that we're talking about, over the line might look different. They might be masking. It might happen at home. They might withdraw. Not coming to school might be a sign that they were tipped over. And getting the balance right is important. You can ask, but young people might just give you the words they think you want to hear so that they make you go away. Or going over the losing it line wasn't a choice, and they might not actually know why it happened. And autistic young people might struggle to imagine what the solutions are. Seemingly complex problems don't always require complex solutions. It's always helpful to reflect on whether the basics are in place. So in the school environment, these commonly include reducing your language, particularly at times of stress, an individual safe space. The learner chooses to go there when they need to regulate themselves, and they get to stay there for as long as they need. Developmentally appropriate individual timetable. Guidance and resources are available around these on the NAIT website. Planned movement breaks tailored to the individual. Practice and prepare for change. Have 2 key adults, and this is especially important at the secondary stage, and have a planned homeschool communication system that's acceptable and agreed by both family and school. And ensure that staff have access to help and support, and they know who to ask for help. And listen to parents. There are links to more information about each of these things in the guide and on our website. We're now going to try something called a chat bomb. We send all our answers at the same time after the countdown, and we'd like you to think about a young person you're working with and tell us one thing you could do to make life more predictable. So if everyone could type their answer in the chat now, but wait before you send it. Wait for the countdown. And send your answer. Thanks for taking part in that. Although anxiety-related absence is perceived as a school problem, it's important to consider the 24-hour life of the child and the impact on the family. The first and most important step is to take time to listen to the family perspective. Discrepancies between behaviour at home and school are common, and they might be indicative of a problem starting to build up. NAIT have partnered with Inquire to create this guidance for families. It's called Talking to Your Child's School About Anxiety-Related Absence. It's on the Inquire website and linked from the NAIT website. And you might want to signpost families to this. Here's a short video made by Katrina Thompson from Inquire, sharing some information that they've gathered through their helpline.
Hi, my name's Kat Thompson. I work for Inquire, the Scottish Advice Service for Additional Support for Learning. Last year, our helpline received 1,755 inquiries from parents, carers and professionals, and anxiety-related absence was an issue in 13% of those. And of those 135 inquiries, 60% were about children and young people with autism. And anxiety-related absence is the most often given reason for a child being out of school in inquiries to our helpline, and it's also an issue that we hear frequently about in our outreach work with families. The common issues that we hear about are concerns about children not accessing any learning when they're unable to attend school. Parents also worried about how that anxiety-related absence is being recorded, as some schools record it as unauthorised absence, which can lead to problems later on. And we've heard of some cases where a child has been referred to the children's reporter. Another very big concern is children being unable to access CAM support, either because they don't meet the threshold of mental health concern to be able to access that urgent support, or because the child is not able or well enough to engage with professionals, or in some cases leave the house to attend appointments. And we have heard that this results in children being taken off the waiting list and being unable to access any services. A common issue is children being unable to access support unless they're attending school, but that the child is not actually well enough to do that. And families report it's very challenging to access any support that helps them get their child to the point where they're able to return to school in person.
Thanks, Kat, for that contribution. It's not uncommon for autistic children and young people to hold it together in one context and for the reaction to be observed at a later time and in a different context. If a parent's regularly reporting distressed behaviour at home, this can be viewed as a need for reasonable adjustments to be made at school. Parents report some of the issues above, which are on page 13 of the NAIT guide, and there are suggested strategies on page 24. We need to understand the individual's desire for friendships and that peer relationships may or may not be a strong contributory factor. Peer relationships can be a positive or negative influence on motivation to come to school. Autistic children and young people are more likely to experience rejection, teasing, and bullying. And there might be a mismatch between how a young person experiences an interaction and the intentions of others. Some autistic people tell us they really are happier in their own company, and for others, they'd like to be part of a friendship group, but they don't always have success. If individuals have become overwhelmed or have had meltdowns, they might think that they have a negative reputation amongst their peers, and they might not be sure quite how to handle these challenges. And reduced attendance can limit opportunities for social connections. And for those who desire it, connectedness with peers can be a protective factor against bullying and therefore promotes attendance. From this point on in the webinar, we're assuming that you've reviewed your inclusive practice in place, that you have had a child planning meeting, and that you're having the right conversations, or that you're looking for a targeted approach now. It's important to keep a lens on inclusive practice, and it might be that you don't need a new plan, you just need people to actually follow the plan that's already been agreed. Do make that reflection. And next, we're going to have an 11-minute contribution, a video from CERT's author Amy Laurent, talking about how to actively engage young people.
Hi, my name is Dr. Amy Laurent, and I am thrilled to have been invited to say a few words about anxiety-related school absence by the National Autism Implementation Team. I have a few slides that I'm going to pop up so that we can talk through those. And I really want to say how much I appreciate the way that NAIT has framed this topic about anxiety-related school absence. And just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I am a co-author of the CERTS model. I am also half of a partnership called Autism Level Up with a developmental psychologist who is also autistic. And so I hope to bring both of our perspectives to this bit of a talk that we've got together. And I thought I'd just talk through this cartoon because it's a really an interesting way to think about it. And so many times it is the time for social skills or time for school or time for whatever. And we get that sharp no back from somebody. I'm not doing that. It's not happening. And the automatic reaction from the partner, not with thinking about the whole context, but the automatic reaction is often, here we go again. He's going to refuse. He likes to make things difficult. It's always the same. He's non-compliant. He's argumentative. This idea of it's a power grab by the individual or the student to not want to go to school. And what we need to do is really examine all the reasons behind that no. No, because, and I know that this is part of NAIT's initiative and how they're rolling out this concept for you, that ability to ask that deep why question. Why is it a no? No, because starts to get us thinking, what are the factors? And this is actually from a tool that Dr. Feedy and I developed called the Person in Context tool. But we can start to think about not just one or two, but maybe many reasons that could be behind that no. And what's important is not just knowing what the reasons are, but also recognizing the interplay and the connectivity of those reasons. So physiological, maybe I only slept 4 hours the night before. Interoception, I need to go to the bathroom, but I don't actually know it, right? Having a sensation in your body, but not registering it, but still having that need, maybe from a sensory perspective. I love this example. This is one that Dr. Feedy's popped in there. The therapist, the teacher, my one-on-one personal teacher wears too much perfume. It's overwhelming to me. These are things that we don't necessarily think about that can be really significant underlying factors. From a motor perspective, maybe the person's a mover and a shaker and school is a really sedentary deal. And that's really hard for somebody. From a cognitive standpoint, not being able to anticipate or know the schedule of the day. The idea of predictability, especially when we're talking about autistic learners, but all learners, is extremely important in terms of supporting regulation and engagement. If somebody doesn't know the schedule, if they're not able to anticipate what's going to happen, they're going to have a very difficult time engaging in what's going on. Communication, is it a good match? Is the dynamics a good match for the person? So that leads to the social too. Are the people that the individual's interacting with, are they people who are responsive to them? Are they people who get them, who react to them, who honor their communication? all of those things are things that we need to be thinking about. And as I said, it's not just one, it's never just one, it's often many. And it's not just many, but the interplay of all those things at the same time. And when we start to think about it in those frameworks, it helps us figure out how to be better, more supportive partners, right? And that's for all of us working in the schools, providing support, but also for home, for family members, trying to figure out how to get that support just right. So thinking about, hey, maybe the situation's overwhelming. Maybe they need more information. I can change my approach to so many things so it's more predictable and more comfortable for the individual. And so when that no comes back, we're ready. We're ready to say, hey, let me come alongside you. Let me not pressure you into something, but let me support you with what you need to be able to engage. And hey, here's the schedule. And instead of sitting for class today, we'll be standing or we'll be moving outside. And, if you're aware that somebody has difficulty with interoception, helping remind them that maybe they need to go to the bathroom. Being a partner who can be really responsive to all those things is really going to set the stage for the type of support that's needed to help individuals. So as part of the support that I've just flashed up, where there's a cartoon on the front, we also have this kind of backstory behind it. It's on autismlevelup.com, and it whole lists all the problem behaviors that we often hear people refer to in schools, talking about common educational approaches, often those compliance and control grabs and those incentives and reward systems, things we know don't work well. Then we talk about the shortcomings of those approaches, why they're not good fits, and then what could really be underlying that. This is a really lengthy support. It's about 5 pages in length. And all of those kind of descriptions and things that match how to provide authentic support are provided there. So I would encourage you all to check it out. It's called When Words Fail, Leveling Up Language to Reflect Experience of the Individual. Because our goal is active engagement. If we're supporting somebody, we want to get them to a place that they're actively engaged with us. So that tool that you just saw me walk through with all those colors, and I talked about all those factors for an individual, that's important. But the important part is that we're not just understanding who the individual is, the supports we're providing get the environment and the activity to align with that individual's needs as much as we can, as we're also scaffolding skill development for the individual. So this tool, this is a different tool, it's called the Person in Context. It allows us to look at where are the mismatches for the individual and where might we need to intervene to help them. Because it's so easy, it is so easy to focus on the surface behaviors, things like this child's academically bright, but they're clearly not invested in academics. They're prone to explosive behaviors, right? We hear all of these types of things. They have anxiety, they're constantly fidgeting, they're never still. It's so easy to focus on the surface behaviors, but we have to dig deeper. We have to ask the why, and we have to know what's going on for that individual. And so this is what, if we filled out that tool fully for somebody, we would want to discover who is the person. It's not good or bad. There's no judgment. It's just what factors are at play for that individual in how they experience the world. This tool is something that we strongly encourage people to dive into, work with families and educational teams together to build the profile of the student. If the student themselves is a conversational individual and they can contribute to it, we absolutely want them to. They're going to reflect their experiences in ways that help us understand how they experience the world. It's going to help us be better partners to figure out where the mismatches in the activity environment are and where we need to provide our authentic and validating support that we want to. Because what this really gets to is supporting this idea of cross-cultural understanding. And what does that mean? It means as much as we think about autistic learners trying to understand neurotypical norms and conventions for interacting and participation in the classroom, we as their partners need to understand them and autistic culture, and we need to make modifications. The only time we're going to get to true equity and real inclusion in education is when this is a true two-way street and this cross-cultural understanding is in place. And it's that cross-cultural understanding which has helped us make this shift from a behavioral management approach to an energy or an emotion regulation approach. And I've got energy here because it's a different way of thinking. And NAIT asked me to touch on that a little bit. Many autistic individuals have difficulties identifying emotion. That is something that's well represented in the literature. There's a concept called alexithymia that is often written about. But when we talk to individuals who struggle with emotional identification, but still have regulatory challenges, and we start to talk to them, they're often very adept at talking about what their energy state is, what their arousal feels like in their body. And if we can tap into that, we can help support them in authentic and validating ways. And so, what do I mean by authentic and validating ways? This is a tool that is really quite useful, and it's something that's really easy to introduce, regardless of the age you're supporting, but it works very well for individuals who are in secondary school. What is your current energy? What are you feeling in your body? So I'm going to ask you to think about that right now. And then what energy do you need to get through this activity? What's going to be supportive of you? So in essence, I've asked you two questions. One's going to be an arrow that you put on the green side of your chart where your energy currently is. And the second is, what energy do I need? It's an arrow that you're going to put on the blue side of your chart. And as you put that blue side of your chart, you're going to look, do my arrows match up? If they do, I'm regulated. I just need to maintain. If my arrows are mismatched, I either have to power up or power down my energy. And that's going to be the strategies that we need. That's going to be regulation. If your arrows mismatch, you're dysregulated. You need a tool or a strategy. And it's a really reassuring and affirming concept for people to start to think about. I need to either power up or power down. And when we're thinking about the tools and strategies to power up and power down, there's many ways to go. And these are really consistent with what we know NAIT has incorporated in their teaching. We know that regulation is an interactive process. So when we're coming into this place and we say there's these mismatches in the activity or environment, we're not putting all the onus on the learner to develop new skills. We're thinking about modifying the activity, modifying the environment. But there is going to come a time where we need to actively support regulation and actively use a tool to help support somebody. And it is very much regulation, an interactive process. It involves individuals and their partners being aware of energy and emotion and joining with and providing support, recognizing where somebody is and what they need, knowing when those errors are mismatched and whether I need to help someone power up or power down. If we get that right, we're going to be trusted, valued partners for individuals. And if we're trusted, valued partners, there's a greater chance that they're going to want to come to school and be with us, and their anxiety is going to be lessened. And so that was a really fast and furious introduction to some of the way that we think inserts and level up about providing support for regulation that will really authentically validate somebody's experience, give them the tools and strategies that they need to feel comfortable in their environments, which are predictable with trustworthy partners.
Resolving anxiety-related absence can take time and planning should be individualised. We've given you some pointers today about getting the basics right in the school environment and supporting the home environment. Within a staged intervention model at this point, we would be expecting partnership across health and education professionals. And we can't really reiterate enough that if we only address part of the picture, we're much less likely to succeed. Any planning needs to take account of the child and young person's needs and preferences with an autism lens on understanding their anxiety. This means focusing on sensory preferences, communication preferences, and the need for predictable, desirable, and meaningful experiences, particularly at times of transition. In our experience, there can be a tendency to see anxiety-related absence as a big problem and for the team to jump to solutions. Actually, we need to take a pause and make sure we're asking the right questions. Are we understanding why they're anxious? Are we keeping the plan focused on making day-to-day life predictable, desirable, and meaningful? In the NAIT Anxiety-Related Absence Guide, there are 2 case studies and more guidance on what you might do, but we'd like to draw your attention to the reflective questions on page 21 of the guide. Asking the right questions might mean doing things differently as a team. We won't go through all of these just now, but some examples might be checking to see if existing plans and strategies are being applied consistently. Do we understand sensory preferences or whether the learner's school day and experiences are meaningful to them? If our goal is for the young person to be motivated to come to school and actively and meaningfully engaged when they're there, then there's no single right solution. The approach we recommend would prioritise an early response and an autism-informed approach over looking for alternatives to school or behavioural approaches such as reward systems. Here are some tried and tested strategies that you might find helpful, and there's more detail in the guide. For autistic learners, soft starts are not a free choice time, but rather they're structured and include known desirable activities, which can be anything from meeting a preferred peer at the gate, having a bowl of cereal, or maybe time alone in the quiet room. If planning a gradual return, limit the number of transitions and work backwards. The end of the day is always the end of the day. It can be tempting to increase the length of time at school in very small increments, but transitions are hard and it's important to have as few as possible. It's essential that the young person has a system to get out of class without having to speak or draw attention to themselves. They need a safe, consistent place to go that feels as though they've left the building. Don't mention being absent and do what you say you'll do. So this is particularly difficult to plan for in high schools with so many staff involved, but communicating with all staff is essential. Plan for unstructured times like lunch and the times immediately before and after school, and consider reducing or removing homework. Expectations are really important, and we need to create opportunities to allow every young person to reach their full potential. So we've shared lots of information today, and you might want to think about things that you're going to keep doing, stop doing, and start doing. We'd like to hear more about local work and share aspects of this model that work in practice, perhaps in a future webinar. We're now going to try another chat bomb. As before, we'll send our answers at the same time after the countdown. So what are your next steps after this webinar? It might be that you're going to read the guide, talk to colleagues, or maybe change some of the way things work in your school. So if you type your answers in the chat, wait for the countdown and send your answer after that. So before we finish, here's a reminder of the NAIT key messages for anxiety-related absence: predictable and desirable, make learning meaningful, learn from when they have attended school, the 24-hour child, have 2 key adults, anticipate transitions, the end of the day is the end of the day, have consistently high expectations, listen without judgment, and good things should just happen. So thank you to everyone who's contributed today, to Alex and the other young people and their parents who've helped us put this together, to colleagues from Education and Health who've met with us over the last few weeks to share updates from local areas, Hayley McMurray from Education Scotland for joining us on the Q&A panel this afternoon, and Donald from the NAIT team for support in the background. And thank you to those who shared video clips: Charlene Tate from Scottish Autism, Katrina Thompson from Enquire, and Amy Laurent from the CERTS and Autism Level Up teams. We look forward to hearing about how you're developing supports in your local areas going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye then.